Hi, I'm Stephen Garvey, founder, leader of National Citizens Alliance. Thank you for joining me today. We have a really interesting presentation and an important presentation on political ideologies. There's a lot of misinformation in the media, in social media networks on political ideologies. It's causing a lot of confusion in Canadians. So we're going to share our perspective today and help provide greater understanding for the Canadian people about political ideologies. And I have a short video I'm going to present, which I find is quite profound, on nationalism. And hopefully it will show a different perspective on this ideology. I'm going to get right into it. I have some notes I'm going to refer to, and then I'll provide some commentary. So the first thing we're going to look at is globalism ideology. We want to make sure you know what this means. Globalism ideology pertains to global world order. You could argue one world government, one world currency, global citizenry, open borders, no borders. So the flip side of this is sovereignty, Canadian sovereignty. Under globalism ideology, sovereignty would be eroded. Another flip side would be Canadian citizenry, but that would be eroded and replaced by global citizenry. And hopefully you, and I know we can see this going on in Canada. It's been going on for decades. In our opinion, all the mainstream parties in Ottawa are behind a globalism ideology, though on the surface, they pretend to be following other ideologies. So we're going to get further into that. We believe globalism ideology, especially in the West, is co-opting other ideologies and religions to divide, distract, silence, to erode traditional values, cultural norms, national sovereignty. We can see this taking place all over the West. But we believe the root ideology behind this is globalism ideology, which is connected to the United Nations. And globalists like George Soros, the Koch brothers, and other globalists. A good way to look at globalism ideology, think global. And if we compare it to nationalism, think local. So one of them is focused on global, the other is focused on local. Globalized economy, globalized political system. This is globalism ideology. And this is why there's a lot of tension in Canada, because the mainstream parties are acting as globalists. They're trying to globalize the political system versus a national economy with global international aspects, a national political system. And it should be noted here, globalists falsely claim that nationalism has no international cooperation in its ideology. That is outright false. They also claim falsely that nationalism has no global aspect. And that is completely false. And I'm going to play this video which will shed light on this.
Britain votes to leave the European Union. The United States elects a president who says he'll put America first. Around the world, nationalism is winning elections. Many see this nationalist revival as the great danger of our time, fearing that nationalism will take us back to a more primitive and racist past. But it wasn't long ago that great political figures such as Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, David Ben-Gurion and Mahatma Gandhi, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher recognized what I call the virtue of nationalism. So what is this virtue? A nationalist believes that the world is governed best when nations are free to chart their own independent course, cultivating their traditions and pursuing their interests without interference. Nationalism is not about racism. All nations are internally diverse. And it isn't about isolationism. Of course, nations can pursue a variety of different policies in diplomacy and trade. Nationalism is the opposite of imperialism, or globalism, or transnationalism, which are all names for the attempt to bring peace and prosperity to the world by uniting mankind under a single political authority. The debate between nationalists and globalists, then, is over whether we should aspire to a world of many independent nations, or to be one unified superstate, like the enlightened federation of the Star Trek movies. A case can be made for both sides of the argument, but for the last 30 years, really since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the Soviet Union, the one world side has been dominant. Today, this is changing, maybe not among elites, but among ordinary citizens, or as they're known in America, the deplorables. It turns out that a lot of people still think good borders make good neighbors. It's hardly surprising that people want to preserve the way of life they and their ancestors built up over centuries, the way of life they believe is best. It's human nature. Our strongest loyalties are to those who are closest to us, to our family, then the larger community or tribe, and finally to the nation. Long ago it was discovered that the key to human freedom is to build political life out of this natural loyalty. By putting decision-making in the hands of the family, the community, and the independent nation, you could get people to cooperate with one another, join in the common defense, and willingly obey laws. The only alternative to this kind of community and nation-based politics is to use force, to coerce obedience. In the 20th century, communism and Nazism both sought to impose a universal vision at gunpoint. Both the communists and the Nazis were imperialists. They wanted to eliminate the independent nations of the world. Nationalism holds that borders are crucial. The border is where each nation's ambitions should stop. This idea first appears in the Bible, where Moses gives borders to Israel and tells the Jews they'll be punished if they trouble their neighbors. True to its biblical roots, the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century made the independent nation-state the political cornerstone of the modern world. When Henry VIII declared that England would no longer obey dictates from Rome, he became Europe's first true nationalist. Soon, additional nations declared their independence, the Dutch from Spain and America from Britain, to cite just two examples. The competition among these newly independent peoples led to an explosion of innovation, bringing unprecedented progress in science, industry, and government. For nearly 400 years, the principle of national independence served as the foundation for a better, freer world. But World War I and World War II changed everything. Traumatized by these catastrophic conflicts, many now seek comfort in a simplistic narrative, ceaselessly repeated, that nationalism caused 2 world wars and the Holocaust. But this is one of the great untruths of our time. Adolf Hitler was no nationalist. He was an imperialist. If his ambitions had been limited to ruling Germans, it would have been terrible for Germany. But the French, the British, the Russians, and everyone else would have been spared a world war. Sadly, European elites learned the wrong lesson, believing that independent nations are inherently dangerous. Better, they reasoned, that all countries should live under one government. In 1992, this vision gave birth to the European Union. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher hated the idea. She didn't want the bureaucrats in Brussels making decisions for Brits in Birmingham. But in the utopian 1990s, Britain thought it was better to dump Thatcher and go with Brussels. It's the spirit of Margaret Thatcher, and indeed of Henry VIII, that reasserted itself in Britain's vote for independence from Europe in June 2016. Donald Trump tapped into the same spirit of nationalism 5 months later in November 2016. Nationalism is making a comeback. If you care about freedom, you should hope it succeeds. I'm Yoram Chazoni, author of The Virtue of Nationalism for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video.
Excellent presentation. I hope everyone valued that presentation. It made some really important points. And most notably, and what the globalists have done, in particular in Canada and other Western nations, they have tried to link nationalism with fascism and imperialism. And that's completely false. And it's just a self-serving agenda of these globalists. The greatest obstacle, the greatest opponent to these globalists are nationalism. And that's what the NCA stands for. We're going to dig deeper now. We're going to look at cultural Marxism. And we can see this going on in Canada and other Western countries. And we believe cultural Marxism is used by globalists to undermine traditional societies, to create division, to wreak havoc on the values of a country, on the cultural norms. And what it is, in a nutshell, is revolution through what's called cultural inversion. And this is where you're flipping society upside down. All the norms of society are flipped upside down. And what it's called is, quote, a long march through the institutions. And it started in 1924 through the Frankfurt School. And then after World War II, it moved to Columbia University in the US. Cultural Marxism grew out of economic Marxism, communism. Economic Marxism and communism were failed systems. And this was another attempt to push Marxism ideology. As I mentioned, we believe it's being used by the globalists to divide. What cultural Marxism does, it's talking about so-called progressive ideology through infiltration of schools, media, society, political institutions, parties, political correctness. And the ultimate aim is the destruction of the traditional family, morphing science into scientism, attack on any kind of spiritualism, morphing women's rights into feminism that pits females against males and vice versa, multiculturalism versus the existing social matrix, sexual revolution, gender confusion, inclusion, diversity, on and on. Hate speech laws that erode freedom of speech and lead to compelled speech where everyone is required to pay lip service to an official narrative. And we see this going on in Canada without question. Anyone who goes against the status quo is going to be attacked. NCA is attacked. We are vilified. But the only way you can combat this tyranny is to take it head on. So do not back down. Do not back down. Pierre Trudeau brought cultural Marxism. He legalized previously illegal sexual practices. He lowered the legal drinking age, the voting age. And obviously with the support of the Conservatives, he amended the charter, brought multiculturalism as an official policy for the first time in our history. He also opened up Canada's immigration policies, and it just spiraled from there. And right now we're at a point in our society that every mainstream political party in Canada is so afraid to espouse any other thing than cultural Marxist values for fear of being politically incorrect and labeled as racist, etc., etc. But we believe they're globalists anyway, and they're just pushing this cultural Marxism to facilitate the divide and undermining the national structure of Canada. And of course, The mainstream parties are all straying to globalist UN Agenda 2030. We have a information video on this on our Facebook and YouTube page, which is advocating. This is what UN Agenda 2030, adopted by Harper, advocates: Marxist hoax as being humanitarian, while globalist elites continue to engage in rampant predatory capitalism to line their own pockets. Their ultimate goal is not to create a higher standard of living or prosperity for humanity. We are just worker bees, proletarians who exist to toil for their financial benefit. And we can see this going on in Canada. How can you explain, since 1968 to present times, that the Conservatives and Liberals added $663.8 billion to the federal debt? $458.9 billion was added by the Conservatives. This is criminal fiscal irresponsibility that only benefits the so-called elites, the banks. And yet Canadians have been silent. Well, we're not silent anymore. Libertarianism. There's no example of this ideology anywhere in the world being implemented. It supports an aggressive free market system that would invariably support monopolies and oligopolies, where the big fish eats the little fish, no regulation, almost anything goes, minimal support for social programs whatsoever. The rich get richer because they had an advantage to begin with to leverage their ambitions. The poor are left to sink and die. Libertarians like the Koch brothers support globalist trade, exploitation of first and third worlds, open borders, mass immigration, exploitation of cheap labor, including temporary foreign workers, illegal migrants, while native workers, many Canadians, are left jobless. And this is a reality. And we were able to show in a video that we released a few days ago that Bernier is tied to the Koch brothers through the Montreal Economic Institute in the Atlas Network, etc., etc. Go look at our article on our blog and our video to learn more about that. But that's very disturbing. And he was behind the highest wireless rates in Canada, some of the highest in the world, because what he did was completely deregulate the wireless industry, which allowed Bell, Telus, and Rogers to eat up all the competition. Now they have an oligopoly, thanks to Bernier, and they're charging high rates. This is libertarianism. It does not work. Do not get fooled by it. Libertarianism is not compatible, obviously, with populism. Populism is a political approach that supports ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by the establishment, so-called elite groups. Libertarians consider themselves to be the elites, and they are operating in their own selfish interests. Populism is obviously diametrically opposed to globalism. Populism places a high value on sovereign nation state, operating in the best interests of its citizens, as opposed to the world collective for corporate profit generation by a network of the well-to-do. And we can see this happening across the West. Nationalism, populism is growing throughout Europe, in the US. NCA its ideology is nationalism and populism as well. Populism and nationalism are the greatest threat to globalism worldwide, which is why the globalist establishment is trying to create the facade that their globalist candidates are populist too. Beware of this. This is going on in the mainstream media, by hired media. They're trying to make these mainstream politicians appear to be populist, when in reality, they are globalist shills. This is all a game of pretense. And we're going to post something further on this tomorrow. And just to touch on this further, the one area where Maxime Bernier is being particularly misleading when he claims to be a libertarian and a populist simultaneously. People who are gullible enough to believe this have no understanding of political ideology or his political connections and past performance, such as his ties to the Koch brothers. Libertarianism is diametrically opposite of populism. Libertarianism is all about unregulation, self-interest, the big fish eating the small fish, and populism is about the common person and doing what's best for our country, our society. Conservatism and liberalism. This is how we view what's going on. The so-called conservative party and liberal party. We would say this: conservative equals liberal, liberal equals conservative, equals globalist. By at least 1968, the conservative and liberal political forces in Canada has merged into a single globalist force with other multi-controlled mainstream opposition. There is no longer any substance to any claims that these ideologies of these parties are different. And the facts show that. The historical facts. Liberalism attempted to portray itself as progressive at one time. Conservatism was portrayed as being traditional, whatever that means. And the Conservative Party then adopted the label progressive. Now it's calling itself centrist, whatever that means. The important point to remember, the false left-right is just a divisive game. The false liberal conservative is just a divisive game. We posted a policy comparison a couple of weeks ago. We posted one today. It shows in those comparisons that there is no difference between those mainstream parties when it comes to policies. And policies are important because that's the basis for decision making. So, the point we want to make clear is National Citizens Alliance is truly populist, nationalist. We stand in full opposition to the globalist mainstream parties. Elect National Citizens Alliance 2019 to save Canada.